It all felt deeply unethical. I went in with pure intentions to make a difference. It really was every day that I'd cry. And then I think I was just suddenly like, I can't do another day of this. I just want to share my story, and I want people to know what I've learned about disease.
We have seen multiple episodes over the past several years where viruses have emerged that have caused cause for concern. And thankfully, to date, time and time again, measures that have been taken by governments, measures that have been taken by the WHO have managed to combat those outbreaks. I think the whole of the medical community is mindful and slightly fearful that eventually there might come a time where such a virus can't be contained.
There are two sets of laws that we have that control human behavior. One is the laws that we make. And in those laws, they say from time to time, it's okay to do this, it's okay to do that. Well, it may be okay and it may be lawful, but nature has its own set of laws. And when you or we as people violate those laws, then nature responds with a consequence all of its own. And it can be a consequence that we as humans can't tolerate.
We're creating these scenarios in which viruses can mutate in that way. It really feels like there's so many alarms going off, and it just isn't being spelled out. I'm Alice Bruff, and I used to be a livestock vet, so I worked for about 4 years in the British pig industry, and I left that about a year ago. As soon as I was old enough to understand there was a job that was involving helping animals, that was the career for me, and I didn't ever consider anything else. It was like, as soon as I could speak, I wanted to be a vet. As soon as I sort of turned 15, I started working on farms every holiday, and then the veterinary degree is 5 years long, so it's a considerable amount of time put towards it, really. So the year before I left, I was actually finalist for Young Pig Vet of the Year. I really put everything into it. I tried incredibly hard to achieve what really was my aim, was to improve the lives of animals, and it was a tough job, and I put everything into it.
So why have you since left that job?
That's a tough question. I think the more I went on, the more I struggled with a sort of concern that I was facilitating something which would be potentially very dangerous to human health further down the line. I felt I've had to step back from that role to feel like I'm not contributing to some of the biggest threats to humanity in the form of pandemics and antimicrobial resistance.
There are many different diseases that have led to pandemics over the history of time, and there's typically some sort of link between human health and animal health within those types of pandemics. About half of infectious diseases people can get can be spread from an animal or be zoonotic. And for emerging infectious diseases particularly, scientists estimate that 3 out of every 4 emerging infectious diseases come from an animal source.
Well, the truth is, when you look at the origins specifically of COVID-19, we think it's come from some of these wet markets in China. And for many of us in the West, we look over there and we say, okay, well, perhaps they should close down. And to a certain extent, that is true. But we should also look in our own back garden and just look at how we are treating animals here. It's not just over there. If we are cooping up our livestock in unsanitary conditions, having to give them antibiotics all the time, we really don't have much of a case to be pointing the finger at anybody else.
The more I looked into it and the more research I looked at, it was sort of like going down the rabbit hole in a sense. Animal agriculture is a big business. It's causing all sorts of major issues. But nobody's joining the dots.
I worked in the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats of the Food and Drug Administration. And in that office, we were preparing for things like pandemics like COVID-19 that we're facing now. I worked with the Center for Disease Control, I worked with the National Institutes of Health, I worked with the military, I worked with Homeland Security. Throughout that entire time, not once did we ever talk about how these emerging diseases come about in the first place. This is the time. If there is any time, this is the time to really look into how these infections come about.
So you think about it, we're about 8 billion humans on this planet right now. But for every human on this planet, there are about 10 land animals raised and killed for food. So we think there are too many humans. Think about how many animals there are. So we're talking about 80 billion land animals being raised and killed for food at one time. You know, with coronavirus, we are being told to socially distance, and rightfully so. But we're doing the absolute opposite with these animals in these farms. We're crowding them into as tight of a space as we can. And that goes against everything that we know about how to contain and prevent the emergence of infectious diseases. Their immune systems are decreased because of the stress that they face, and then they're so densely packed. So it's so easy for one animal to catch an infection and then pass it on to another animal, and then the virus can spread like wildfire.
So far, they've been able to verify the deadly strain of flu virus is passed on from chickens to people. 4 people have come down.
In 1997, with the emergence of H5N1, it was a highly pathogenic influenza virus that emerged from chicken farms in China. Now that virus had a lethality rate of about 60%. Think about it, this was a virus that killed 60 out of 100 people who contracted the virus. So you can imagine how deadly that virus is. I mean, that is a scary, scary virus. H5N1 came out from animal agriculture, and it is still out there, and it is still circulating, and it is still mutating. We are not done with H5N1.
It's a ticking time bomb, you know, what's happening in these factory farms and the influenza strains that are coming out.
It's no coincidence that when we think of past pandemics, we think of swine flu and avian flu, and pigs and chickens are the most intensively farmed animals on the planet. Intensive farming acts as a crucible for the development of pathogenic organisms. It's our insatiable need for cheap food and for animal protein. If we didn't have those, we wouldn't have a lot of the drivers for zoonotic emergence.
So I'd be driving every day, farm to farm, and seeing generally similar sort of problems across the board, whether that be disease or welfare issues. And these conditions are not exceptional, not one-offs. This is really how our meat, dairy and eggs are produced every day. We do a lot of unnatural things to animals. You know, we routinely mutilate young animals. We cut off teeth, tails, testicles, beaks, horns, which creates a direct route into the bloodstream for bacteria, and it's also greatly stressful and painful, obviously. We all know dairy calves are removed from their mothers almost straight away. Chickens don't get any time with their mothers, and piglets are weaned at about 3 to 4 weeks old. When you move them into an environment that's frightening for them, away from their mum, and on a completely different feed, it's very common to see things like post-weaning salmonella or E. coli diarrhea or meningitis. Generally, when there's been an outbreak of disease that requires my input, I'll go and take some samples, and I might, you know, swab some tonsils or nostrils or take some blood from the jugular vein. And the whole time, I'm kind of leaning down in front of the nose and mouth of a pig which might have potentially died from something like swine flu, which could potentially pass to me, or, you know, some unknown disease which we haven't discovered yet. The level of ammonia coming from, you know, tons of waste from these animals, and the dust that builds up, everything that those pigs are breathing out, you're just breathing in. So you come out and your eyes are red and streaming and you're choking, and but those pigs are in it 24/7. You know, that's the reason we see so much respiratory disease, and you see lungs coming through the abattoir that have got pneumonia and various bacterial diseases, like the concoctions of respiratory pathogens because of those enclosed spaces are phenomenal. It was quite soul-destroying, really, because most of the time what I felt was probably the best option for the animals that I saw suffering or sick or injured was to shoot them, and I was doing that most days. You know, I carried a bolt gun in my car and a screwdriver to euthanize animals daily. It just wasn't, it wasn't really what I signed up for as a vet, to be honest. In order to shoot an animal, you have to look them in the eyes. That was a kind of daily occurrence. I'd go home with these eyes of animals that were utterly miserable. I'd have horrible nightmares all the time about killing animals, and spent quite a lot of time in slaughterhouses, and I'd just get this sort of recurring loop of animals getting killed in my dreams. The way that I dealt with it at the time was, if I'm not doing it, then somebody else will who probably doesn't care.
These are studies that show drops in lung function around factory farms and things like that. So there are many, many, many studies that very clearly show disease. If you look at every step along the pathway, the use of animals for food causes disease in humans, starting with the farms. The people who work there and the people who live there. We see increased rates of respiratory ailments, GI ailments from water contamination, increased rates of skin and wound infections. Then you move on to the slaughterhouses. As they are slaughtering the animals, they're often opening the belly. And when they're opening the belly, they're often having to do it so quickly that they're tearing into the intestines. So now you have spillage of intestinal contents, i.e. feces, splashing on the person, on the flesh itself. Then you move to the processing of it. So you now have products that are contaminated with bacteria. There are plenty of studies to show this. Now you shift over to the consumer, because now the product has moved on to the consumer.
There was a study done by the University of Minnesota in which they went to 10 large retailers and collected samples of the meat, the pork, and the beef products sold in all of those grocery stores. And they sampled them, and they found that there was E. coli in 60 to 70% of the beef and the pork products, and 92% of the chicken products. So these are just some of the infectious disease risks that are coming out from these factory farms.
Another bleak day of record COVID figures, and at Croydon University Hospital it is status red. Ambulances asked to take patients elsewhere if at all possible across London.
COVID-19 has pretty much brought the world to its knees. Over 1 million people have now died. Obviously that's a huge number of people to have lost their lives. It's a huge number of people to be out of work, unable to socialise. But the thing to remember is that COVID-19, it's spread very quickly and it's infected a lot of people, but potential pathogens for pandemics in the future have much, much higher mortality rates. The CDC have kind of tipped the next pandemic as an avian influenza, which has a mortality rate of 40%. It's a horrifying thought, but it's a very real possibility, and the more that we're creating these scenarios in which viruses can mutate in that way, there is a very real risk of something much worse than COVID-19 happening. We only need to look at pandemics from the past to know this.
Well, the last global pandemic that we had was the swine flu pandemic of 2009. Scientists are fairly certain that it originated from a factory farm. Now, global estimates place about 500,000 people as casualties of that last pandemic. So incredibly serious stuff originating right down the road from a massive pig facility. And it makes sense that that pig farm was ground zero for the 2009 pandemic. Pigs and humans share a lot of genetic material. So pigs are this perfect host. And when that happens, influenza mutates, and it can become highly pathogenic and wreak absolute havoc in the human population.
As far as the 1918 pandemic, we know why that happened. It was a virulent disease, and it occurred when troops were being moved all over the world. So you had massive movement of people in confined spaces. Just because the 1918 flu did not involve factory farms, it does not mean that it didn't involve other animals. In fact, they recently sequenced the genome by taking samples from lung tissue of people who had actually died of the Spanish flu, and they found genetic material for avian viruses, swine viruses, so very clearly there is still some relationship between the 1918 flu and animal use. We very clearly know that the more recent epidemics, the 1957 epidemic, the 1968 epidemic, 2009 swine flu, these were all related to our use of animals.
We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's like there's no bigger wake-up call. I don't know what more we need to start taking action on this. Like the only thing that's going to stop us from picking up zoonotic disease is stopping messing with animals.
But obviously we don't know for sure where COVID came from. People are very focused on the wildlife trade and even these lab leak theories, but in particular people are looking at wet markets. So because we don't have anything like that over here, to what extent can we wash our hands of these issues?
I went to document a wet market. In this wet market, there were several stalls that have live frogs, bullfrogs that are kept in cages and slaughtered on the spot, that have turtles kept in buckets, and they stay there in dirty water, in their own feces. They are not fed, they are kept in stressful and cramped conditions. There are no hygiene precautions whatsoever. And this is really an environment that is really ripe for having all kinds of pathogens develop and transmit, again, very easily from one bucket to another bucket. We cannot talk about physical distancing and apply really strict measures, prevent people from visiting their loved ones, while allowing these wet markets to still continue business as usual. This is not okay.
Coronavirus, right? Kung flu, yeah. Kung flu.
Asians around the world have reported discrimination linked to coronavirus.
Those we've spoken to feared the numbers being verbally abused and assaulted will rise even more sharply in the weeks ahead.
This year, even from the end of January, I would say, before COVID-19 had hit the UK, I was sitting on the train to work and someone sat down, looked at me and got straight back up, covering their face with like the collar of their coat. And I looked around and I'm like, they're not doing it to anyone else. It's pretty obvious what's going on here.
The new strain of coronavirus.
All the media reports only showed East Asian people. We noticed like a 60% decrease in overall sales, and then footfall was so far down. You'd see people walk past and point and laugh. I could notice people saying things like, don't bother supporting them, Chinese people are dogs, they eat bats, they're so dirty. I've never known a level of like racism as explicitly and as common as during this time. I definitely feel that the finger's pointed to people just generally not in the West.
Inevitably, when something bad happens, you can look to blame someone else, and in doing so, what you can end up doing is alienating parts of your own society. I think pointing the finger, we're kind of missing the crux of it, which is that our own patterns of consumption, whether that's food, fashion, entertainment, are driving us down a road that's not going to be easy to come back from.
It's really interesting looking at the conditions of wet markets in China. Animals stacked on top of each other, mired in their own feces and urine, highly stressed, close human and animal contact. And that's where we suspect COVID-19 came from. But if you take those similar characteristics and look at factory farms in the West, in the UK, in America, all over Europe, extremely similar situations of incredibly stressed animals who are denied all that comes naturally to them. And it's when human beings treat animals badly, we see disease mutating quite quickly and then jumping the species barrier. So the comparisons between wet markets and factory farms, I think, are incredibly fair. And as a Western society, we absolutely must look at what's happening in our own backyard first.
Even if we just look at the wildlife trade and ignore factory farming, even that's not something we can completely wash our hands of.
Yeah, it's easy to say that the problem started over there. It's not our fault. It's much harder to turn the mirror onto ourselves and look at how we are increasing our risks for these infectious diseases. Every country is involved in this wildlife trade. That leads to things like the wet market, that leads to animals being shipped around the globe, captured from the wild, used in circuses, used to stock zoos, used for laboratory experiments, used as medicinal objects, used for their fur and their skin and their meat. And the United States is one of the biggest importers and biggest exporters of wildlife. Europe is a big importer and exporter of wildlife too, so we're a huge culprit. We are exposing ourselves to more animals, we're shipping them around the globe. These animals are treated incredibly horribly. They're distressed and their immune systems are down, so they can very easily catch infectious diseases. And so the wildlife trade brings together a lot of sick species which normally would not interact with each other.
Are we hypocrites? I sort of think we are, because we ignore the parts of wildlife trade that we want to ignore because they serve our purpose. And we cry out against the parts of wildlife trade that we've decided are unacceptable. The wildlife trade is pervasive. I mean, it's kind of everywhere. And it's not just the things that we read about in the headlines of the papers, you know, ivory trade, rhino horn trade, you know, tigers being traded, pangolins being traded. It's things that we sort of don't even think about. And we are, in the West, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in the UK, consumers of many of those products that are internationally traded. Forests contain value, huge value in timber species. And so those arterial roads that forge their way into the forest means that we have gone into the wild in a way that is massively destructive and carries with it enormous risk. And back down that road come the logs, but come the wildlife, comes the disease. So it's now like a beating heart. We are pumping blood into the forest and we're seeing the blood sucked out of it. And here we are.
HIV and Ebola were carried by non-human primates and chimpanzees, but because of the bushmeat trade and because of the logging industry that really destroyed a lot of the natural habitat of these animals, it brought humans really much closer to these animals. And we suspect that it is that combination, the logging industry and the bushmeat trade, that caused the first HIV infection in a human. And we suspect that's how we got Ebola. When we're destroying the natural habitats of animals, we are increasing the opportunities for humans to come into contact with species that may carry infectious diseases that we may not have encountered before.
The wildlife trade is destructive. It's destructive to ecological habitats, it's destructive to many species, and it's destructive for us because it increases our risk of infectious diseases. We don't need it. That needs to end.
I think the problem is, one of the central problems is that we are just consumers. Consumers on a massive scale. Just the sheer number of people and the fact that they need to eat and they need somewhere to sleep and they're going to have things in their house if they're lucky enough to have a house. And all of those things drive the engine of consumption around the world. And what we don't realize is that that will be the cause of our own destruction, because we're not the stewards of the planet, we're the exploiters of the planet right now.
History has taught us, and what we're seeing now is teaching us, that anywhere and any way that we treat animals badly or unnaturally, it leads to problems, not only for the animals, but also for us.
So, yeah, do you want to tell me what that letter is?
So I am currently under investigation by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, which means that I'm at risk of having my licence to practice revoked.
And why are you under investigation?
I publicly spoke about my experience within the pig industry.
So that's all you've done? You've literally just spoken about your experiences?
Yes, pretty much. And essentially what their problem is with that is that my comments could undermine the integrity of the veterinary profession and damage the reputation.
And how does it feel receiving that letter?
I suppose quite shocked and quite scared, because I don't feel I ever did anything wrong as a vet, and I feel like I was a very good vet, and it feels a little bit of an injustice. Since then, I've kind of looked through previous cases that have gone to court of vets and nurses under disciplinary action, and you've got actual paedophiles, sex offenders, drink drivers who've caused death, theft of controlled drugs, that sort of thing. So to be lumped in with actual criminals when I've purely, given a few truthful opinions of my own experience, is quite challenging to take, to be honest.
Like I told you, they don't even want to talk to me. That's why I'm talking to you right now. They don't want to talk to me. It's just ridiculous. And I feel like if people knew before they got into the business what they would have to go through if they made a complaint or was dissatisfied, what they would have to go through to get an answer to something, they wouldn't get into it.
Was there anything to do with this particular film that was an impacting factor in all this?
Yes. So the company cites Rudy's allowing a film team to come into his barns as a reason for termination. He was terminated not because he did anything wrong, not because he violated anything in his contract. He was terminated because he was speaking out against the company. I think the industry hopes that Rudy will be a signal to other farmers, you better shut up or you're going to get your contract canceled.
The industry works incredibly hard to stop people from exposing its secrets.
So, given that you're being told you're not allowed to talk about these things, does that mean that you will stop talking about them and that you can't be a part of this film anymore as well?
No, I won't be silenced. I've only ever acted in accordance with the oath that I swore on entry to the profession, so no amount of bullying or threats will stop me from doing what I know to be right. particularly when there's another issue we haven't spoken about yet that's infinitely more pressing than my career and potentially much more devastating than a pandemic.
Great, are you comfortable in everything? Brilliant, okay. If we start off and you just tell me who you are and what roles you have had in the past and what you're doing now.
Professor Dame Sally Davis. I'm the Master of Trinity College and the Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance for the UK government. Until this time last year, I was the Chief Medical Officer for England and the most senior medical advisor to the UK government.
And given your experience, what is it that worries you most about where human health is heading?
It's really interesting. Climate change is of the moment. The younger generation have really taken it up, and I'm delighted because it matters. But actually, AMR will kill us before climate change, and we need everyone to understand that. AMR is a pandemic. It's just a slow-growing one, unlike COVID, which happened really fast. What we're seeing is that bugs, whether they're bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, are evolving to develop resistance to the very medicines we use to treat them. And unfortunately, the end result, if this goes on, will be really dreadful. And I've talked about the post-antibiotic apocalypse, where, you'd see a lot longer stays in hospital, much higher mortality, and go back to the era before penicillin. Antimicrobial resistance keeps me awake at night.
What this really looks like, if we don't have effective antibiotics in the future, is taking your brother, your child, your wife to hospital in their prime of life and knowing as you arrive that there's nothing that can be done. That's what this really means.
So antibiotic-resistant infections or antibiotic-resistant bacteria evolve whenever we use antibiotics. And so the main driving force is the overuse of antibiotics. The other major factor, though, is poor hygiene, poor water, lack of wastewater treatment in lower and middle income countries is a major problem. So those two things together, poor hygiene and high drug use, is what fuels this whole crisis that we're in today.
Antibiotics actually have been a victim of their own success. They've been so useful. So since 1928, when Fleming discovered the first antibiotic and it got mass-produced, we've just taken it for granted that these antibiotics are always going to be there and that we'll always have a means to treat an infection, which isn't the case anymore, really.
There is a big issue when it comes to the overuse of antibiotics. But the problem is, even if all doctors stopped prescribing antibiotics, the animal industry are getting so many antibiotics that what we do makes very little difference.
For the past 5 to 10 years, doctors have felt it is important to reduce overprescription of antibiotics. And this is important because we want to limit the antibiotic resistance that we're seeing in our patients. What's more frustrating, I think, to me and other doctors like me who are aware of the risk is that we have no control, there's no monitoring, there's no limitation currently on antibiotic use in factory farms.
This is a box of kind of the remnants of documents and conference notes, etc., that I've kept from my years in the pig industry. It is quite strange coming out and sort of, re-looking at this and looking at the sheer volume of antibiotics that I was using and are used sort of regularly. Hundreds of tons worth of feed with antibiotics added. Most of the pigs bred and slaughtered for meat will at some point require antibiotics, and most of the time it's because of how we're keeping them and what we're doing to them. You can't cut off someone's teeth and tail and put them into a really contaminated, cold environment and expect them to not need some sort of help.
Antibiotics go hand in hand with factory farms. These animals would not survive long enough to be productive, to be able to produce the meat that the agribusiness is counting on without antibiotics. Studies have shown that we have seen antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the animals in factory farms, in the workers who are working in factory farms, in the meat that's being sold in the grocery stores, in the soil, in the land, in the air, downstream from factory farms. We are finding antibiotic-resistant bacteria. There is no doubt that the feeding of animals in factory farms heavily contributes to this ridiculous rise in antibiotic resistance.
So it was discovered that if you fed really low doses of antibiotics in animal feed, that the animals would grow faster. By 2006, the European Union banned the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. But this didn't resolve the problem because they were still available for routine use on veterinary prescription. And essentially, antibiotic use, the misuse, just continued on. And there is no doubt whatsoever that if we continue along that path, we are heading for an antibiotic apocalypse.
Do you have any idea if the birds are being given anything? Antibiotics?
I have no idea. All I know is what's on the feed ticket, and that's fiber, protein, fat. But they don't tell you nothing. But you'll see, you've seen the birds when they're 8 days old, and you'll see them when they're 29 days old today, and you'll see the difference. So, you know, there's got to be something. I don't know what it is. I ain't never checked into it.
So you're saying that's kind of not natural?
No, it's not natural.
More than 70% of the entire use of antibiotics worldwide is being used in farm animals to prop up this disease-ridden system. We have the new pandemic already emerging, a pandemic of people dying every year because of antibiotic resistance, because of the way that we've kept animals for all of these years.
What we see is a lot of people during a pandemic don't actually die from the virus itself, but they die from the secondary bacterial infections that follow. And if we're going to continue to see a rise in infectious diseases because of the wildlife trade, because of ecological, environmental destruction, because of factory farming, we need antibiotics.
Are those guidances sufficient in terms of making sure that antibiotic use is safe?
They're called guidances because they were voluntary. This isn't a regulation that the FDA is legislating. This is a suggestion to the companies that are selling the antibiotics, hey guys, maybe stop selling these things.
In the UK, the industry is quite good at saying, oh, we're not the only ones to blame, or animal agriculture isn't the only problem, and therefore sort of ridding themselves of blame entirely. And I think there'd be a lot of chatter around, oh, well, we're making a conscious effort to reduce usage, but it's not quick enough. Yes, over the last 5 years, we've had a target to hit and we have dropped down, but it's sort of gone like that. So we had when we started monitoring, it really dropped down because we realised that what we were doing was ridiculous. And then it's sort of got to a point where the amount of antibiotics we're using now is clearly what we need to keep those animals alive in a system which is not good for those animals. Short of, you know, knocking down half the farms that we have here and starting again, I don't think we're going to achieve a huge drop in usage.
What's really scary is that this issue of this coming post-antibiotic era is essentially being swept under the carpet. Yes, some things are being done, but you scroll back 5 years ago and half the world's antibiotics were being fed to farm animals. Now it's 70% or more. Things are going in the wrong direction. Continue as we are, then the prediction is that 10 million people a year by the middle of this century could be dying because we squandered antibiotics.
In some ways, it sounds hyperbolic, the end of medicine, but without fixing the underlying problem, the systemic problems that lead to this cycle of new drug followed by resistant bacteria, new drug, resistant bacteria, new drug, resistant bacteria. If we don't fix that system, then eventually we're gonna just run out of ways to safely kill these pathogens. And that's not a place we wanna be in.
Yeah, I don't think the prospect of the end of medicine is exaggerated at all. I think it's perfectly feasible, and it's been forecast. I mean, it's clear that we're doing many, many things wrong, which are a huge risk to human health, and for some reason our governments are still funding it.
So we asked the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs if they'd be part of this film, just so we could ask them a few questions, but they've refused our request. So as a politician, why do you think that is?
I think it's that they wouldn't want to be pinned down. So I think my worry would be that they've become a bit more entrenched in the old school way of thinking and didn't want to be put on the spot, didn't want to be challenged.
So what is it you feel they don't want to talk about, and do you think they accept that this is even a real issue?
Animal agriculture is very influential in terms of relationships with politicians and trying to influence the political agenda. They've moved from denying there's an issue at all and thinking it's just like the cranks that talk about this, to now there's an acknowledgement as an issue, so they're paying lip service to the fact this is something that we recognise that we need to do something about. Yeah, I think we're now in that territory where it's how can we make them act now that they've had to acknowledge that there's an issue.
When it comes to governments in America, why aren't they doing more to address these issues?
When people elect someone, they think they're electing their congressperson or their state senator or their local elected. They didn't realize that there's a hidden arm to politics and decision-making in this country, and it's those who are paid by large corporations to lobby government and influence the decision. The lives of voters are really put to the back burner, and the lives of those lobbyists and those special interests have controlled these important decisions that are impacting our kitchen tables every day.
The fact that our governmental agencies are kind of in bed, really, with big agribusinesses is a crime, because rather than protecting us, the people, our governmental agencies are protecting agribusiness industries instead.
Government mantra is often about cheap food, and that is why we have factory farming, essentially to produce cheap meat for the masses. But what that disguises is the true cost of that cheap meat. What's happened is that for years, the factory farm industry has had the government in its pockets. It's had millions of pounds to throw at lobbying and making sure that it gets its way. And so what's happened is that factory farming is now locked in to our food system.
The governor of South Dakota says she is trying to help reopen the pork plant there, the site of one of America's biggest outbreaks. More than 800 cases linked to that plant, many of them immigrants. Smack up and now on the outbreak and the dilemma many essential workers face.
It's frustrating because the very industries and the practices that have caused this issue are being treated as essential, and the workers treated as essential workers, and what that means is that they're kind of being treated like disposable entities. And we know that living near these places and working on these places means that you are going to be disproportionately affected, not only by COVID-19, but other disease issues and health issues.
We see a wide variety of illnesses in patients who live and work around factory farms. One of the things that we notice with factory farms is a decrease in air quality around them, and it's due to a few factors. One of them is the risk of aerosolized endotoxins. Another one is the chemicals that we're seeing, so the pesticides, but also chemicals like ammonia from the excrement and things like that. And finally, we know there's a larger proportion of things like gram-negative bacteria or fecal bacteria that are known to cause illness in humans. One of my colleagues had a patient who had a multi-drug resistant urinary tract infection, incredibly rare resistance pattern. No real reason for this patient in particular to have this type of infection, no risk factors. Her only risk factor was when you Googled her address, she lived within a mile of a factory farm.
I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you this, as I'm flying over those factory farms and I can smell, sometimes I can smell that hog waste at 2,000 feet in the air, my common sense tells me that this is a health risk, a health hazard. Pigs in eastern North Carolina are producing more fecal waste each and every day as is produced by all the people in the states of North Carolina, California, New York, Texas, New Hampshire, and North Dakota. And they're putting it in these huge ponds, these cesspools that they call lagoons, and when they fill up, they simply dump it on the ground under the pretext of growing crops. It runs into our rivers, fish begin to die, the people get sick. It's no secret why these farms, they're not farms, why these factories are here. It's money. It's big money. And it's coming at the expense of the people who live nearby.
The people who work in factory farms, the people who live near factory farms are far more likely to be low-income people of color. This is in part because the industries have a tendency to preferentially place their farms in these communities of disenfranchised populations.
We are being denied clean air, clean water, and they don't even seem to care. Majority of all these dirty industries, CAFOs, whatever, landfills, they're all located in communities of color, Latino and Native American communities. That's where they are. But the owners are not black, they're not Latino, they're not Native American. So why aren't they in their neighborhoods?
We feel like it's intentional that they cite themselves in these communities, and we call it environmental racism. Putting stuff in some place that you wouldn't put in your own community. You know, you don't want it near you, so you just put it over here and you put it on people, you know, that you think can't fight back.
Every house along this street, you can count at least one person in the household that had cancer. A couple of days I started to go outside to play with my dogs and it smelled so bad I just didn't even try to go outside and play. I don't think it's people of color just being overlooked here. I think they're overlooked everywhere. They are least likely to be represented in any elected position. And if they eventually do get someone elected in a position, there usually aren't enough of those voices to actually make a change.
This thing is a constant war on black and brown people in these communities, and we deserve to live free from this type of constant aggression. You start to see a trend of the same health problems. You start to see respiratory issues. You know, you start to see high blood pressure in children. When I think of my children, I think that's why I fight so hard, because I do want my children to live in a world where they don't have to think about environmental injustices. People are dying from things that don't have to be just so somebody can make a profit.
Yeah, we got to stay positive. Evilness, fear, and those kinds of things that do nothing but destroy you. And we're going to get it done. We've lost some great people that have been working on this along the way, but God doesn't intend for everybody to see the end product.
When it comes to factory farming, we know we've got all of these issues, antimicrobial resistance, infectious disease, racial injustice. With all of this coming from factory farms, does that mean that the solution is switching to free-range and cage-free and small-scale farms?
In my experience of smaller farms, they're not really what I think people like to imagine when they say, oh, I only buy from a small family farm. Probably some of the worst concoctions of disease I've ever seen have been on small farms because they don't have the income to afford comprehensive diagnostic testing, perhaps preventative healthcare. You know, part of the reason why African swine fever has ripped through China in the way that it has is because there were so many backyard farmers. So in terms of disease surveillance and knowing what's going on within an animal population, it's almost impossible to regulate huge numbers of small farms. And it's also just deeply impractical. You know, if people do want free-range meat, we'd have to have about 12 planets. Clearing land for livestock grazing and feed cropping is the #1 driver of deforestation worldwide. Feeding the current demand for animal products with many smaller farms would increase that land use.
So whether we factory farm animals or raise them in small farms, it's not sustainable. If you look at the numbers, right, human population is about 7.8 billion, and the population of animals that we kill is about 80 billion a year, which means the earth is not just supporting us, she's also supporting all the animals we are raising for food. And our animals eat 7.3 billion tons of food. So we deforest land to feed our animals to feed us. So animal exploitation is the #1 reason why we are in an unsustainable situation. So when we say we'll go back to small-scale farming, we are basically saying the problem is not that we are eating animal foods. The problem is that the riffraff are eating animal foods. You know, if you can make the poor people stop eating animal foods, there'll be plenty for the rich to eat animal foods. So it's a very classist, colonialist argument to make. And I'm just shocked that anyone would make it in this day and age.
We cannot feed the whole world the same diet we're eating at the moment. If we do carry on, we're not going to have a planet left. For instance, in this country, we use about 1 million hectares of South American rainforest to feed our livestock. So that's someone else's land.
And that's just the UK.
And that's just the UK. You're feeding those animals resources that can be fed directly to people. My concern is with the desire to keep making meat, where's the land going to come from?
Globally, we're very concerned about deforestation at the moment. There's a lot of emphasis on, you know, retaining our forest land to combat climate change. And looking at the Amazon, vast swathes are cleared for cattle grazing and for livestock feed growing. But when you look out at countryside like this, we've already done it here. Like, most of Britain's forest land has been cleared already for agriculture, and that's reflective across the globe.
Biodiversity itself is a protective mechanism against the emergence of zoonotic diseases. The more biodiversity you have, generally, the less likely there is to be a zoonotic emergence, because the diversity of life, the mosaic of species, prevents any one pathogen from building up in large amounts. So as we reduce biodiversity, we increase the chances of zoonotic emergence. So it's a lose-lose situation for the human race if we're going to continue down this road.
And I'm happy to say that you're going to see the first shot done right here, right now.
In the current pandemic, we're at a place where we're now looking for answers. Vaccines, treatments, how to get people off ventilators, on ventilators. I still think we're missing the point. 90% of the people who have died from COVID-19 have had at least one underlying disease. That's a lifestyle illness, diabetes, high blood pressure. So rather than just mopping up with drugs and treatment, why don't we get to the fundamental root cause?
We know that animal products, again, not just meat, but dairy, fish, eggs, all of these have been linked to increased rates of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, Alzheimer's, some forms of cancer.
COVID-19 did not create the crises of chronic diseases. For far too long, we have been attempting to push these diseases under the proverbial rug, but COVID-19 sort of forced us to move that rug and show what's under there. And the chronic diseases are fed the deaths and hospitalization of COVID-19.
Our top killers are mostly lifestyle related, and much of that is related to the consumption of saturated fat, animal protein, and of course these animal products. I feel like my career is dedicated to cleaning up the mess that factory farming and animal agriculture is causing with these major public health problems.
If we think that there may be tens of thousands of potential COVID-19-like viruses out there that, given the opportunity, could cause an epidemic or pandemic in people, we can't go out and develop vaccines to every one of those tens of thousands of viruses and treatments for every one of them and so on. We have to have general principles that we can learn from, such as what are the risk behaviors?
I feel bad. I've got a great grandson being born as I'm talking to you right now. My granddaughter is in the hospital giving birth. And I don't think that boy, Parker, is going to have much of a life. There's no guarantee that we're going to be able as humans to live on this planet forever. And in the way we're going, personally, I don't think we will. There's enough left for me in my lifetime. There's enough left. And there's enough left for my daughter and my son, but is there enough left for my granddaughter Amy and for Parker, who's coming in this world today? I don't think so.
It's very hard to communicate the scale of what we're facing, but I'm going to try and speak into my own experiences of direct involvement in practices which are not only drawing us closer to the climate emergency, but are creating human pandemics, global health crises, and bringing us ever closer to a man-made disaster.
Yeah, are you surprised by the amount of comments you've got online?
Not especially. I mean, it was never going to be good coming out a sort of multi-billion-pound industry and completely sort of denouncing all their practices. Obviously, as a vet that's done a particular job for 4 years, if I'm saying I did this and this is what happened, like, I'm not making that up. Like, it's quite frustrating. It would have been very easy to stay in a relatively well-paid job, getting flown around the world, wined and dined by pharmaceutical companies, like doing a secure job, you know, and just carried on. But I didn't feel like that was the right thing to do.
So how are you making money? If you don't mind, you don't have to talk about this. How are you making?
Basically, I'm not. Like, I'm doing this because I feel like I need to. I don't quite know how to work it out, like, financially, but yeah.
What will you do, or is there a plan of like how to eventually make money?
No, I think, yeah, I don't know.
So what would your solution be?
Gosh. I try not to get too political. Can I just say we should all be vegan? Solve the problem straight off. If everybody on the planet was vegan, we could release, well, billions of hectares of land for wildlife, basically, because we wouldn't need that land to grow food, to feed animals, to feed us, because that's the most inefficient way of growing food. If we just ate what we grew, then there would be plentiful supplies of food on the planet, not just for the 8 billion people that we're racing towards now, but for many, many billions more. This planet could be much more sustainable if we didn't eat meat and we didn't eat animal products. It's contentious to say that, but actually that's where the science tells us we have to go if we're going to survive on this planet as a human race.
We've been here on this farm now for 33 years. I've been farming organically for over 45. We grow a whole range of vegetables and some fruit. Everything's grown without the use of any animal inputs at all, so we don't use animal manure, any slaughterhouse waste, or any product from animal whatsoever. We're using just the land we have for our production. We get very good yields, we get very high quality produce.
So what would you say to somebody who said there's no way of feeding everybody without using animal inputs?
Well, that again is something we've proved to be completely wrong. I mean, our production is actually per acre is far higher than most other farms would be, because we're not dependent on somebody else's land to support that fertility. So actually, our production is very much higher. Our footprint compared with a farm producing livestock is incredibly tiny. So, the question really should be, can we afford not to farm in this way rather than can we afford to farm in this way? Because actually this is a much more productive way of producing food.
We do need to take back control of our health. The good news is that this is possible. So personally, I have a plant-based diet, and I have that because I believe it's the healthiest diet to have. Most studies will tell us that by having a totally plant-based diet, low in fat, low in sugar, reduced amount of salt, it indicates that you'll have a healthier lifestyle. Your diet becomes more nutrient-dense rather than calorie-dense, and that is good for everybody. This will not be the last pandemic. I believe that if we take this seriously and get to the root cause, we have a chance of really staving off so many illnesses in the future.
We tell our school children, you have to eat meat, otherwise you won't get enough protein, which is an outright lie. We tell them you have to drink milk, otherwise we won't get enough calcium. This is an outright lie. So when we build an entire civilization on lies, it is unsustainable. Because sustainability is about getting into alignment with the truth. All that is true is sustainable. Lies are not sustainable.
One of my mentors, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, stated that we spend a lifetime pulling people out of the river. No one goes upstream and prevent them from falling in the first place. Right now, we're dealing with sick care instead of health care. If we go upstream and teach young people about healthy foods and how to consume them, how to grow them, if we switch from waiting for people to get ill and go to preventing them from getting ill, if we go upstream, and by doing so, we'll live a more healthy lifestyle. It's not about living forever. It's about having the quality of life while you are alive.
We don't have to wait for our governments to do the right thing, because I guarantee we're going to be waiting for a long, long time. So what each of us can do in the meantime is really take a hard look at what we eat. Ultimately, what's good for animals is good for us. When we treat animals with kindness and respect, we also benefit. There is just no downside to having this increased empathy and to treating animals better. There is no downside to that. There's only upsides to that. There's only benefits, not only for the animals, but also for us. Despite everything I just talked about with you today, I actually am optimistic about the future, and maybe it's a bit of a Pollyannish attitude, I don't know, or maybe I'm just a sucker, but I am optimistic because I do believe that empathy is an integral part of who we are as a species, and that will continue to grow. And with that recognition, I do believe that our behaviors will change for the better.
We know that our use of animals undeniably contributes to the climate and ecological emergency. It's undeniably inhumane for animals and for people. And we know that we're going to see the end of medicine as we know it within our lifetimes if we don't all take responsibility to change. I mean, it was awful. It was really, really horrible stuff going on and really horrible things that I had to kind of be involved in. And I think perhaps if I hadn't gone on and shared that in the hope that I can make some sort of positive change, then it would just be carried with me for the rest of my life. Everything will stay the same if nobody speaks out.
Change is inevitable, but transformation is intentional. Transformation is something that we choose to do because we are uncomfortable with the status quo. And we say, we can do something about this. We can actually make this change happen. So getting to a sustainable civilization is getting to a civilization that is aligned with the truth, that is aligned with morality. We have to transform ourselves if we really want to transform the world.
Oh, you know, I meant to say, I don't know if this is what you were asking, but when you were asking what worries me day to day, I meant to say that currently our complete lack of faith in science is worrying me. Okay, so I'll add that.